Welcome back to Zero Dark Emissions. Last time we left off with getting all of the remaining components for the rolling chassis prepped and painted, and in this episode we'll be getting the entire rear end reinstalled, starting with rebuilding the geared hubs. For the geared hubs, I have already purchased new input and output seals, as well as a new washer key and new grade 8 hardware. I'll start off by installing the new output seal, which goes in very easily. Next, the spacer ring at the output side goes on, and this does need to be placed in the correct direction with the thinner portion of the ring facing out toward the bearing. Now we can insert the output gear into the housing, and then we can place the housing and gear over the spindle, aligning the splines into place. Next goes in the spacer ring at the opposite side, which also needs to be placed in the correct direction, again with the thinner portion of the ring facing out, also toward the bearing. Then the bearing, followed by the flat washer, followed by the washer key, followed by the retainer nut. In order to set the bearings, we first need to slightly over-tighten the retainer nut and then spin the output several times in both directions. Then the nut can be loosened and retightened to its final torque. Finally, the two washer key tabs that align with the grooves in the retainer nut can be tapped in. Next, we can apply RTV sealant at the steering cover interface and reinstall the steering cover. These are getting new grade 8 hardware for these bolts and washers. Now we will install the new input seal. RTV sealant at the access cover and new grade 8 hardware here as well. With all four geared hubs reassembled, moving on to the diff covers. Again, RTV sealant at the interface. And I'm using stainless steel hardware for these bolts. I like the look better than zinc-plated grade 8, and I don't need the strength. Prior to reinstalling the diffs, I'm going to reinstall both the mounting brackets as well as the brake adapters, just as I took it out. And next we will loosely reinstall the output flanges, including new star washers. These will be tightened when back on the vehicle. Note that of the two plugs, the fill plug at the back of the diff is the non-magnetic one, and the magnetic one is the drain plug at the bottom of the diff. To reinstall the diff, I used my engine lift with a strap cradling the diff around the outputs, and that worked very well. It required that I started lifting with the input of the diff facing up slightly to clear the crossmember, and then I gradually rotated it down into the opening of the crossmember as I continued to lift. After getting roughly in place, I reinstalled the two support rails at the top. With the rails in place, I continued lifting the diff to get the support brackets up to the support rails. And finally, the support bracket can be reinstalled. Next, we will get the control arms back into place. Now we will loosely reinstall the new ball joints onto the geared hubs, and these are the smaller of the two ball joint options available for my early model. There's a better way to install the geared hubs back in, which you will see in the next episode where we handle the front, essentially attaching the ball joints to the control arms first, and then installing the geared hubs onto the ball joints. This method that you are seeing now worked, but definitely easier to do it the other way. Another little housekeeping item is to replace the bolts on the tie rods. This is really just aesthetic and done after painting. And then we can reinstall the tie rod at the frame only. We will keep free at the geared hub until after the shocks and coils are reinstalled. Okay, so I have a small problem here. You'll remember back when I put this shim plate in for the purposes of shimming out these two main frame rails to get a little more room for a battery box. I said that it shouldn't affect anything in terms of performance. And then I don't think that will screw up the larger performance of the vehicle. Well, it turns out there is a small problem here. So this shim plate is basically acting as a camber shim also for the geared hub. So you remember also I said that this was already towed in a little bit, and I removed one of the shim plates to get it, back to being zero camber, but then this shim plate is cambering it out way more than that. So, and I'll just show you down here. You can see this is just by eye, you can see that this is cambered in a little bit. So fortunately, I still have shim plates that I can remove to hopefully counteract the shim that I put in here. I'm going to start with taking out the two shim plates that are easily removable by just sliding them out. And then there's one more that's supposed to be, I think, like a permanent shim plate. It doesn't have the slots in it, but I guess if necessary I could remove that one also. So I got to disassemble some things here, take out these shim plates, and hopefully get this back to zero camber. Okay, so I took out the two slotted shims at the driver's side, as well as all of the shims at the passenger side. The passenger side had less overall shims, so I left the non-slotted shim at the driver's side to keep both sides roughly equal to each other. I think I still have some positive camber, but I think it should be less than it was, and I will just have to live with it. Next we will get the shocks and coils back in, starting with mounting the shocks to the lower brackets. It's important to get these mounted at the right angle now, since the bolt cannot be accessed when reinstalled. I traced the shock mounting on a piece of cardboard before I disassembled, but essentially the shock lines up with the angle on the bracket. To reinstall the shocks and coils on the vehicle, I found that using this procedure worked well. I started out with the lower control arm fully collapsed, so that I could get the top of the coil around the ring at the top and the bottom of the coil in behind the ridge at the rear that keeps it set into place. Next, I lifted the bottom arm slightly, just enough to get the coil set into place, also adjusting to make sure that I have a good gap at the bottom of the coil between the end of the coil and the stop on the lower control arm, which should have about a finger's width of spacing. At this point, I can get the shock and bracket assembly up into place and get one of the two bottom bolts into place. The second one cannot be placed until we get further along. Next, I get my quote-unquote Marshall post into place for compression of the coil. Marshall may need to trademark that. This allows me now to compress the coil until I get to the point where I can get the second bolt into place and fully hand tighten both bolts so that the shock is fully pushed up into place. Now I can continue to compress the spring until it aligns with the bolt hole. Note that the shock needs to be fully extended. For one of the shocks, I extended it well in advance of the reinstall, and it retracted somewhat before I reinstalled it, and I couldn't figure out why I could not compress the coil as much as I needed to get it to align. With the shock bolt in place and the jack removed, we can now install the tie rod and reconnect the upper ball joint. Next we will get the half shafts reinstalled, but first we need to retighten the output flange nuts. As with the removal, we are temporarily installing one of the half shaft bolts into the flange in order to limit the rotation while tightening. This is the hardware that I am using for the half shaft connection at the diff output flange. In addition to Loctite, I am using a Nord lock washer, which is supposedly better than Loctite or a split ring lock washer in terms of keeping the bolts in place. Getting the brake rotors and half shafts into place is a little tricky in that you need to align the holes at both the rotors and half shafts with the holes on the output flange. I found that the best way to do this is to work from the bottom, getting one hole lined and loosely bolted, and then spin the assembly around to the opposite side in order to get it from that side, and then work around to all of the bolt locations. Tightening the castle nuts to spec is a little tricky in that the ball joints sometimes want to spin. I found that a clamp placed on the joint in order to get it seated tightly allowed me to get it tight enough to then get it torqued. I kept the old brake line fittings on while painting to essentially mask the holes, but now I'll replace with new fittings. I thought that it might be a bit tight getting the calipers back into place, but these went in really easily. The key is to make sure that you have the caliper pistons compressed ahead of time and really ahead of painting to avoid messing up the paint. One of the last items to complete the rear is to get the vent lines installed at the geared hubs and diffs. Just getting this in partially at the rear for now. We will complete and extend to the front later. I'm installing new vent line along with new clips, but using the old bolts, just cleaned up and painted. I think that these bolts are tough to come by. They're not just normal bolts, they have a bit of a taper to them, so I took care to save these. I also saved and cleaned up the little brass vent line fittings. Lastly, we can grease the ball joints, 6 points back here. And fill the geared hubs and diffs with oil. And finally, get the rear wheels back on. We will talk a little bit more about wheels in the next episode when I have a little more time. And now here is the fully reinstalled rear end, which will do it for now. Next time we'll be reinstalling the front end, and since much of this is repetitive from the rear, I will focus mostly on the unique aspects of the front, such as the steering components and sway bar, as well as the remaining miscellaneous items to complete the rolling chassis. See you next time.